The room froze before anyone understood why. One moment, the Admiral's voice carried its usual amused authority, echoing across the steel briefing chamber. The next, silence pressed against the walls like a rising tide. Officers shifted in their seats. A few smirked, expecting entertainment, the kind that arrived whenever someone junior became the target of a harmless jab. But this time, something was different. The Admiral had asked the question casually, almost lazily. "And you, Lieutenant, what's your call sign?" His tone carrying the faintest edge of amusement, as if he expected a predictable, unremarkable reply. He had said it to test her confidence, to measure the tremor in her voice, the bend in her spine. She was new, young, unassuming at first glance, and surrounded by older men who believed they'd already mapped the measure of her worth. But the instant the words slipped from her lips, the chamber changed, Night Fox, not loud, not confrontational. Just steady, controlled, a name delivered without ornament, without apology, without any desire to impress. The officers nearest her stiffened. Something flickered across a few faces, disbelief, then recognition, then the faintest ripple of unease. A cold wave swept through the room, subtle but unmistakable, traveling row by row. It was the kind of reaction one couldn't force, the kind only a past soaked in quiet, dangerous truth could ever command. The Admiral's halves, mild-faltered, barely perceptible, but enough for everyone to notice. His fingers paused mid, gesture on his desk. For the first time that morning he looked at her, not the resume version of her, not the fresh, pressed uniform her. The stillness in her eyes, the way she held her breath like someone used to living between heartbeats, told a story without a single word spoken. Night Fox, the call sign wasn't just a nickname, it was a shadow. A reputation whispered across training ranges after dusk, murmured by men who had seen impossible things executed by someone they couldn't easily define. She had moved like a rumor, accomplished tasks that required more precision than bravado, more control than rage. There had been questions about her past missions, whose files were sealed so tightly, even senior officers couldn't pry them open. Her arrival here had felt like an accident to some, a curiosity to others. But now, suddenly, her presence was reinterpreted with a quiet, gnawing dread. A few officers lowered their eyes, unsure whether to appear respectful or invisible. Night Fox did not shift, did not blink. Her composure was unnervingly calm. She seemed to stand outside the pride and ego that filled the room, as if she understood exactly what the Admiral had tried to do and forgave him before he could regret it. But the Admiral did regret it, not out of embarrassment, but because of the piercing certainty beginning to form in the air. He had underestimated her, and in the SEAL command misjudgment was not a harmless thing. It was a crack that swallowed teams whole. It was the difference between who returned home and who didn't. A leader could not afford such blindness. Something in the Admiral's chest tightened. For a brief moment, he felt as though he was staring at a storm he had accidentally summoned. Outside, the wind shifted across the base runway. The night before had brought a cold front, and the scent of pine drifted faintly through the ventilation system. But here, inside the room, the air had grown thick, sharpened at the edges, like the world paused to consider what had just been awakened. Night Fox waited, steady, silent, unapologetic, and for the first time since assuming command, the Admiral found himself unsure of his own footing. The Admiral recovered quickly, at least on the surface. Years of command had trained him to mask hesitation beneath a practiced stillness. Yet something in his expression, a faint tightening around the eyes, betrayed the internal shift he couldn't fully swallow. The officers sensed it, they always did. When the high, estranked man in the room faltered even for a heartbeat, everyone felt the tremor ripple through the floor. Night Fox remained motionless, as if her call sign were nothing more than a simple fact like her height, or eye color, or the steady rhythm of her breathing. She didn't bask in the reaction, she didn't shrink from it either. Her silence wasn't prideful. It was shaped from discipline, the kind forged in places where adrenaline became a liability and noise became a death sentence. The Admiral cleared his throat and continued the briefing, but the energy had shifted in a way he couldn't steer back to neutrality. Every instruction he gave felt strangely exposed, as though someone else in the room held an invisible thread that subtly redirected the atmosphere. And though Night Fox spoke not a single word, every officer was acutely aware of her presence, as if she carried some gravitational pull that reshaped the emotional center of the space. When the briefing ended, he dismissed the room with a short nod. Officers rose in controlled waves, boots tapping lightly against the floor, uniforms rustling in the low hum of movement. But instead of the usual laughter or chatter that followed a long morning, an uncanny quiet accompanied them. Men who normally exchanged casual jabs kept their heads forward. Even those who prided themselves on disrespect maintained an uncharacteristic restraint. Night Fox moved as the others moved, no faster, no slower. Her steps were precise, effortless. She carried herself like someone who understood shadows intimately, someone who didn't need to assert herself to be noticed. That in itself drew more curiosity than any boast could have. The Admiral watched her from the corner of his eye as she exited. A subtle question pulsed at the back of his mind, heavier each time he attempted to dismiss it. He had encountered dozens of operators with impressive records, men and women shaped by conflict and conditioned by the unending grind of discipline. But Night Fox radiated something else, something colder, quieter, almost unsettling in its restraint. He found himself replaying her call sign the way she had spoken it, no tremble, no effort to soften it, no attempt to make it more palatable. She had spoken it as though she had already accepted that her truth didn't require the validation of the room. Outside the briefing hall, the day carried a low, overcast glow. Clouds hung like heavy wool above the base, muting the world into softer grays. The runway stretched across the horizon, dotted with aircraft, their metallic frames catching what little sunlight broke through. The wind still carried the scent of pine, sharper now, cooled by the faint drizzle that had begun falling. Night Fox paused beneath the covered walkway, letting the moisture cling to the fabric of her sleeves. For a moment she seemed to be listening, not to the rain, but to something deeper, some memory, some echo of another time when silence had also signaled a shift in her life. The Admiral appeared beside her moments later, his steps measured. He didn't speak. He simply stood near her as though proximity alone could help him understand the weight behind her name. A part of him felt the need to justify his earlier tone, to explain the joke, to smooth the wrinkle he had created. But another part older, wiser, knew that apology wasn't what the moment demanded. Night Fox didn't look at him, yet she acknowledged his presence with a slight tilt of her head, the faintest gesture of respect. Not submission, respect. What struck him most was the absence of resentment in her posture, no hint of wounded pride, no simmering anger. Instead, she radiated a deliberate calm, a serenity that felt earned through hardship rather than granted by nature. The Admiral realized suddenly that she wasn't merely composed, she was prepared, not for conflict, not for confrontation, but for something that demanded far more from the soul. Something quiet, something relentless. He inhaled slowly, absorbing the sensation of standing beside someone whose history he did not know, but whose shadow he could already feel. When she finally walked away, her figure disappearing into the muted daylight, the Admiral remained rooted in place. An unsettling thought took hold as the drizzle grew into steady rain. He had asked for a call sign out of habit, out of arrogance, if he were honest with himself. But what he had awakened felt nothing like a joke. It felt like the beginning of a reckoning. Night settled over the base like ink spreading across paper, slow, inevitable, swallowing color until only the faint glow of security lights carved the outline of the compound. The Admiral sat alone in his office, a single lamp casting long shadows across stacks of mission files. He had spent the past hour reviewing personnel reports, but his thoughts refused to obey him. They drifted repeatedly, unbidden, persistent, back to that moment in the briefing room. Night Fox, the name looped through his mind with an almost intrusive insistence. At first it had been annoyance, then curiosity, then something deeper, heavier, edging into concern. Call signs were meant to symbolize skill, personality, sometimes tragedy, sometimes triumph, but hers felt earned in a way he could not decipher. He pulled her file closer, though he had already skimmed it earlier that day. It was thin, too thin. Pages redacted until they resembled black, tout mosaics. Operations marked with classification levels that outranked his own clearance. Evaluations written in clipped, cautious language that praised performance but concealed context. He flipped to her deployment history, scanning for anything that might reveal the truth. Nothing. She was a ghost shaped into a soldier. Rain tapped against the office window in a soft, repetitive rhythm. The Admiral leaned back in his chair, feeling the quiet weight of responsibility pressing into his bones. His job was to know the people under his command, every strength, every weakness, every fracture line that could break under pressure. But Night Fox had arrived with walls no one had managed to breach. Outside, she walked alone along the dimly lit path bordering the training field. The ground was slick with rain, reflecting scattered lights like fragments of broken stars. She moved with a stillness that didn't match the physical world around her, as if her mind were conversing with its own ghosts instead of the present moment. And she was, beneath her composure, the memory of another command room lingered another leader who had once looked at her the way the Admiral had today. With amusement, with disbelief, with the quiet, dangerous certainty that she would never rise beyond the limits they projected onto her. She had proven that leader wrong. She had proven many wrong, and yet the victories never stayed with her. The failures did, the losses did. The nights where silence became the only companion she could trust, those stayed, carved in her ribs like unhealed cracks. Night Fox paused at the far end of the field and closed her eyes against the wind. She remembered faces she had once tried to save. Voices that had faded mid-sentence. Promises she had carried on her back until they became too heavy to lift. The Admiral did not know any of this. He did not know that her call sign had not been given as praise, nor as mockery, but born from a night where she had crawled through pitch black terrain alone, guiding a wounded teammate whose breathing had been ragged with fear. She had whispered to him to stay awake, stay alive, stay with her, even as gunfire cracked like bones in the dark. When she reached the extraction point at dawn, carrying him across her shoulders, someone had murmured the words that would follow her for years to come. She moved like a fox in the night, silent, relentless, impossible to catch. But the man she saved didn't live past sunrise. The call sign stayed, so did the blame. The Admiral, unaware of the history unraveling in the shadows, rose from his desk and stepped toward the window. He needed to decide whether his earlier misjudgment was a simple misstep or a warning. Leadership demanded humility, the willingness to confront one's own cracks. And yet he sensed something else, something unspoken. That Night Fox carried a piece of truth he could not ignore. He spotted her outside, standing perfectly still near the training grounds, facing the darkness as though listening to it breathe. Her silhouette appeared motionless, carved against the faint light. She looked like someone bracing against memories the world would never hear. A question formed in his mind with a weight that surprised him. What happened to her? Outside, Night Fox opened her eyes. She felt watched not by suspicion, but by fate shifting its stance. Change often arrived quietly, without permission, on nights just like this. She sensed something pulling her toward a crossroads she had avoided for years, something that would demand more from her than obedience or discipline, something that required truth. She turned away from the darkness and began walking back toward the heart of the base. This storm was not overhead yet, but she felt it gathering. And somewhere deep within the command structure she had just entered, another storm had begun to build as well. Dawn broke quietly, slipping pale gold light across the compound, as if trying not to disturb the heavy thoughts lingering from the night before. The base woke to its usual rhythm, boots striking pavement, distant hum of engines warming, murmured conversations drifting between buildings. But an undercurrent of anticipation threaded through morning air. Word had spread quickly, carried in cautious whispers. The Admiral had taken an interest in the new lieutenant, and not the casual kind. Inside the command center, the Admiral stood with his palms pressed against the edge of the table, studying a fresh intelligence report. The mission brief projected before him displayed satellite imagery of a valley carved deep into hostile terrain. A missing reconnaissance team, a signal faint enough to be mistaken for static, a deadline that tightened like a noose with each passing minute. He knew this operation would demand more than skill. It required someone who could move through darkness, navigate uncertainty, and carry others out with the force of sheer will. Someone who could operate without the armor of glory or applause. Someone like her. He heard footsteps enter the room, neither rushed nor hesitant. Night Fox approached with her usual air of quiet certainty, the kind that didn't need permission to exist. She stood across from him, her expression smooth but not unreadable. There was always something beneath her eyes, a depth that felt like it could swallow the room if she ever allowed it. The Admiral studied her carefully, not with arrogance this time, but with intent. He saw the discipline carved into her stance, the scars she didn't wear on her skin but carried in her breath. He understood what he had failed to grasp before. She was not defined by mystery, but by survival. He briefed her without embellishment. No theatrics, no insincere attempts to command her respect. She listened silently, absorbing every detail, not once interrupting. Her breathing remained steady, though the weight of the mission hung like ice between them. She didn't fear the risk. She feared failure. Not for herself, but for whoever waited in that valley, clinging to hope with bloodied hands. When he finished, she simply nodded. It wasn't obedience, it was acceptance of duty, forged through loss. As she turned to leave, the Admiral spoke not loudly, but with a sincerity sharpened by humility. He told her he had underestimated her, not because she lacked presence, but because she carried herself with the kind of restraint that hid the storm inside her. He admitted he had mistaken her quiet for fragility, when in truth it was a kind of strength he rarely witnessed. She paused. For the first time since stepping onto this base, something shifted in her posture. A faint, almost invisible crack in the walls she kept around herself. She didn't offer reassurance, she didn't soften, but she acknowledged his confession with a single, grounded breath, allowing the moment to settle without judgment. And that was more powerful than forgiveness. Hours later, the mission unfolded under a sky thick with cloud, the valley steeped in shadows deeper than the early morning sunlight could penetrate. The terrain clawed at her boots as she descended, her movements fluid, intentional. Every sound mattered. Every breath mattered. She was alone, yet the silence felt familiar. An old companion that sharpened her senses rather than consuming her. She found the missing team huddled within a fractured ravine, one of them barely conscious, their radio damaged beyond repair. Fear clung to them like damp earth. When they saw her, their disbelief was immediate, their relief palpable. She steadied them one by one, her comb a tether holding their panic at bay. She lifted the most injured man over her shoulders, his weight pressing hard against her bones, echoing the memory she had carried for years. But this time the outcome was different. This time dawn rose and someone lived because of her. Hours later, when the helicopter blades finally sliced through the valley winds, the pilot caught sight of her emerging from the ravine, mud, streaked, soaked in sweat, breath steady, carrying last man as though the mountain itself had no power over her. The team behind her limped, but they lived. Every one of them lived. Back on base, the Admiral watched her step out of the aircraft. The wind whipped at her gear, sunlight casting thin halos along the edges of her silhouette. The rescued team spoke her name in tones laced with awe, but she didn't bask in it. She simply made sure each of them was stable, then stepped aside, exhaling the weight she had carried in silence. The Admiral approached her slowly, the gravity of the moment pulling every officer's gaze toward them. No words were necessary, but he spoke anyway, because truth sometimes required air. He called her by her name. Then, with a steadiness that honored everything she had just done, he addressed her by her call sign. Night Fox, not as a jest, not as a curiosity, as acknowledgement. The command center fell into a hush, not out of fear but respect. Pure, unfiltered, unmistakable respect. Night Fox met his gaze, the faintest flicker of emotion crossing her eyes, something too subtle to define, yet powerful enough to shift the ground beneath both of them. For the first time, the Admiral saw not the shadow of her past, but the unyielding force of who she had become. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was reverence. It was understanding. And for Night Fox, it was the first silence that did not feel like a burden, but a beginning.